So welcome again. In our session today, we're going to be exploring how companies are tackling the challenges of agricultural supply chain decarbonization, and how they're taking action today, despite a dynamic and ever-changing voluntary and regulatory landscape. So we're going to look at some specific project types. We'll discuss how the impact of these evolving standards and regulations are impacting agricultural supply chain action. And we'll discuss some best practices in terms of ways to avoid greenwashing and protecting investments companies might be making in agricultural supply chain decarbonization. So we have some great guests today. We have Guillaume Bonnard, Senior Climate Scientist at SustainCert, and we have Mike Aquino, Director of ESG at IDFA. So I'd like each panelist, I'm sorry, to introduce themselves. If we could start with you, Guillaume.
Yeah, no worries. Hi, everybody. I'm Guillaume Bonnard. As John just said, I'm a senior climate scientist. My background is mostly in life cycle assessments and conducting product or system analysis. I've been at SustainCert for over 3 years now, I think, and I mostly focus on food and ag and talking with my clients about how to properly do an intervention or making them understand what are the rules and requirements that we have as a VVB or validation and verification body against Scope 3 standards, corporate standards, or the LSRGs or land sector and removal guidance. SustainCert is a sort of a company that is trying to, as a mission, help companies through technologies and whatnot, quicken and facilitate validation and verification. But again, as most of you are probably aware, we're only a VVB. There is many people in this ecosystem that are important to make sure that GHG reductions and removals are actually implemented and are helping decarbonize our value chains.
Great. Thanks, Guillaume. And Mike, if you'd like to introduce yourself and IDFA.
Yes, excellent. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning. And thanks to 3 Degrees for hosting this panel. So my name is Mike Aquino. I'm Director of ESG and Sustainability Issues at the International Dairy Foods Association, or IDFA. We are primarily a representative of dairy processors. So that includes cooperatives that are farmer-owned all the way through to branded product owners. But we are that one step removed from the farm level. And so we'll get into that a little when we talk about Scope 3 emissions. If you've, at least in the US, if you've consumed any dairy products today, chances are one of our members have had a role in processing it. That's kind of how we describe ourselves. And as a trade association, you'll hear that I focus a lot on the policy aspects of what's going on. And Gina, could you advance one slide? I have one little slide to give some context. So I wanted to show this to the audience just to get us thinking about what's going on and when we try to tackle supply chain emissions in these rather complex commodity supply chains. And so we do a survey periodically. The last one was on 2023 data, and it was specifically with IDFA members. And we ask about some sustainability issues. And I thought that this slide stood out to me, and I've been using it around town, so to speak, to show people what's going on. Very high level, we saw as a conclusion from that survey that we have 3 different groups that show us progression in supply chain emissions management. And so starting on the left, basically I sum it up as folks or companies rather that are building capacity to make sure that they can meet their reporting requirements to either customers or regulatory bodies. And so we see a lot of our members, over 70%, ready to do that or getting ready to do that. And that includes Scope 3 management, so measuring emissions back to the farm level. But then if you see in that middle sort of acting phase, these are our members that are trying to figure out how to execute, I think, more intentionally against their specific emissions reduction commitments. And that involves integrating into supply agreements. So procurement's very heavily involved. And then this last group is interesting because I suspect it might grow over time, and that's on the right. And this is a subset of our members that are already thinking about carbon ownership rights in the supply chain. So you might read between the lines and think, okay, well, that could connect to brand claims and marketing claims and backing them up in the future. I think first and foremost, though, it acknowledges that we see some challenges with how carbon gets allocated when we have products that are value added, and then we have co-products and byproducts. So, we can pull the milk apart into different components, right? So I think it acknowledges the complexity of tracking carbon in that way, and also the reality that some of our supply chains are interacting with carbon markets in the future or today. Today, we know they are in the sense of some regulatory marketplaces. But in the future, we think we might see more voluntary carbon marketplace. And so that, I think, is why some of our members are talking to their vendors or upstream about the ownership of removals and reductions. So that's what I wanted to use to just tee up some of the themes that we're going to talk about later today, that ultimately tie to financing these projects along supply chains, and then trying to monitor and report credibly on the outcomes.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. And we'll get into some of these topics more in depth today. So thanks for teeing that up. And likewise for folks, I just wanted to give a brief overview of 3 degrees and an example of what it means to take action in these uncertain times. So, for those that aren't aware, 3 degrees is a climate solutions provider. We've been active in agricultural supply chains for over 20 years, developing projects. And we work up and down the value chain. So for example, we work with middle value chain companies like Land O'Lakes, dairy co-ops, helping them with programs. We work downstream in the value chain with groups like Nestle. And of course, we work on farm. We'll be using this word supply chain reduction a little bit today. Supply chain reduction, sometimes they're called insets, sometimes they're called value chain interventions. It's an umbrella term for any action in the supply chain within the scope 3 boundary that reduces emissions. 3 degrees, there's tons of sources of emissions within any company's supply chain. 3 degrees focuses on a couple of those sources: manure management, feed additives for cows, being some big ones. But I actually wanted to provide just an example of what we do in fertilizer manufacturing, just as an example of some of that work. So for those that aren't aware, fertilizer manufacturing is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. It's about 2.6 gigatons of CO2e are emitted annually globally from fertilizer production, which is more than shipping and aviation combined. It's a major source of emissions. It also comes somewhere like 5 to 20% of the typical emission factor for an agricultural commodity is from the manufacturing of fertilizer. So, and while the emission reductions are relatively low cost, the challenge for food companies is that these interventions are very large. So it's difficult for one individual company to finance one of these interventions. And they're also far upstream from many companies, which makes claims really difficult. So to address this problem, 3 degrees recently launched the Low Carbon Fertilizer Alliance. It's an aggregated buying group that includes Mars and a number of other Fortune 200 food companies. And it also includes CF Industries, which is the largest global manufacturer of nitrogen-based fertilizers. And why I wanted to bring it up today is one of the important value adds of the alliance is that it coordinates the approach to reporting and claims for the members. So the Alliance recently concluded a set of technical workshops where it basically published the reporting and claims guidance version 1 that basically builds on some of the standards that we're going to talk about today, but applies it specifically to this intervention type and provides step-by-step instructions for how companies can claim these emission reductions and integrate them into their greenhouse gas reporting. And the benefit of this is I think we're going to see today that there's a fair amount of ambiguity and a fair amount of change happening in the reporting landscape. So for folks that are trying to, and companies that are trying to act now by going about the claims and the reporting in a similar way from all the other companies participating in the alliance. It provides, a level of assurance and risk mitigation that our members really appreciate. So I just wanted to start by giving an example, but then I think from there we can launch into the panel discussion. So the goal of the panel today is to really focus on taking action today despite uncertainty. There's so many sources of uncertainty in the greenhouse gas scope 3 world for agriculture. Compliance regulations changing, market disruptions, federal disruptions for folks that are participating with USDA grants in the United States. But the worst case scenario is that companies wait on the sidelines for the next 2 to 5 years to take action on climate change until some of these risks are ironed out. So I want to start off today's conversation with just a landscape, and I understand that a lot of the participants are somewhat far along. But Guillaume, if you could start, just speak to the current landscape for Scope 3 reporting for companies with agricultural supply chains.
Yeah, of course, no problem. So Scope 3 agriculture reporting is very dependent. It's a land sector activity where a lot of the emissions or the fluxes that are happening is a land-based emission. Land-based means that it's falling under the land sector and removal guidance or land sector and removal standard. Most of you would be aware of this. As of last week, as you've probably all seen, the land sector removal guidance and standard is been pushed back from March or Q1 to Q4 2025. This means that there is still a lot of uncertainty at the moment of exactly what to expect when we have land sector emissions and so on and so forth. This is at the moment what the requirement would be, because land sector LSRG, I'll just use this acronym for the rest of the panel, is supplementary to the Scope 3, which is also supplementary to the corporate standards, meaning that it is for food and ag and agricultural value chain an essential piece to record for corporates the emissions that is within their Scope 3 value chains. In relation to LSRG, there is also, of course, this SBTI part, the flag, where how to set the targets and so on, because LSRG, if you look into the details of it, only talks about removal accounting, emission accounting, land use, etc. But it does not talk about targets. That is the role more of the SBTI or even the corporate standards from GHGP. As a result, this flag target is also evolving to reflect the changes that we would expect in LSRG as well. In terms of those two, these are the primary two standards that for reports for an inventory creation that are being pushed forward. Of course, there is also the regulatory changes that we might want to jump into in the future. But first, there is also the Vera Scope 3 standard that is being developed, has been being developed for the past about a year. For those that don't know, SustainCert is in collaboration with Vera to kind of push the development of that standard through both harmonizing or standardizing the terminology. For those that are aware in carbon accounting, someone might say intervention for one thing, but it might mean a different thing for another. A reduction might mean something else for someone else. The terminology is a bit of a mess. So we're kind of supporting them on that, as well as joint communication aspects and collaboration on the tech aspect or the technological aspect. So Vera is at the moment really building that Scope 3 standard. And as of, I think 3 days ago on Friday, they actually opened for consultation for the Scope 3 standard program. So they have published a set of documents through their working group, a proposition about product equivalency and so on, to be able to claim these mitigation outcomes, these reductions or these removals along the value chain for these investors. So please to take a look, it's on their website, you will see it. It's a pretty good, strong work so far.
Great.
In terms,
Guillaume, yeah, sorry,
yes,
go
please.
on, sorry.
No, I was going to go into the guidances that exist, but please, John.
So I guess going back to the GHGP and SBTI, I think one of the takeaways is in both cases, the timeline of some of these, refinements to the standards will be, years, not months. So I guess my question is, so how do we think about some of these other like more voluntary, like the Veriscope 3 that you were just talking about, and maybe some sector specific guidance standards in relation to like the GHGP and SBTI evolutions?
That's a very good question. I think the primary aspect to consider is that it is not months that we're expecting for the LSRG, it is a year and a half. Just to recall what I was meaning before is that there would be regulatory aspects behind it. The county, the state of California, or the country of Australia, or the European Union is putting into regulations GHGP based um, um, rules and laws. As a result, we're expecting GHGP to kind of move and kind of settle in on a smaller timeline than we expect. On terms of guidances or standards that are beyond the GHGP, voluntary or not, these will develop at their own rates. Vera is supposed to fill a gap where there is no regulatory obligation for companies to report mitigation outcomes and so on. In my understanding, Canada or the US as a whole don't have these regulatory pressures. So there is a voluntary carbon market or voluntary inset or intervention or reduction market there. These will develop in their own rights. Vera, I believe, is one of the foremost runner for it.
Okay, great. Yep, and we see our clients excited about the developments in the Veriscope 3. Also, would you put like the AIM standards and things like that somewhat in that same bucket as well?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
okay.
yes. I would also put the work that relating back to GHGP again. There is the market-based mechanism or AMI, a market instrument working group that they have in place. That this will come in 2028. Basically, a sort of working group to kind of bring harmony to all these voluntary carbon claims or reductions, remove all of these intervention-based aspects to be able to have a harmonized language, to be all speaking the same language. This, however, as you alluded to, John, this is in 2028. This is years away. So there is this gap at the moment that is being filled by all of these regular voluntary standards, such as Vera.
Yep. So I think that does set the stage on the voluntary side, or and the role of some of these other standards like Veriscope 3, AIM, to provide some guidance for companies looking to take action today and not wait 3, 4, 5 years for the rules to kind of match with the realities of their supply chain and their sourcing strategies. Let's talk a little bit about some of the mandatory and compliance aspects of Scope 3 greenhouse gas reporting. So, Mike, I'd love to start with you as it relates to perhaps shining a little spotlight on how the what's going on in California is kind of like impacting Scope 3 reporting.
Sure. Okay, so the California Climate Disclosure Package, that's what I refer to it as. So two main laws that were passed, SB or Senate Bill 253 and SB 261. Those are the key regulatory disclosure mandates that are on the horizon for my members that are giving them pause and making them hustle to get ready for reporting at the moment. That's because most of my members are US based. But I would say I think it's obvious that the California regulations are influenced by, say, the EU CSRD situation. Though, as we've maybe seen on LinkedIn and in the news, that could perhaps be softening or delayed a little. There's always something new to read about. But my point is there's other jurisdictions that do have mandatory reporting that affect some of my member companies that are operating internationally. But so focused on the US, we've been looking at California, and that's largely because, as many of you probably know, the US Securities Exchange Commission climate-related rules I'm suspecting are going away at this point. But at the very least, we know that when it was published, Scope 3 was excluded. So we said, okay, well, next up is California. And I should know, we expect some other states to follow suit, especially since the federal level mandate is likely going away. So let's focus on California for a minute. They have an open comment period. So those laws were signed into play, if you will. The California Air Resources Board, CARB, now is set to implement, right? And so they have an open comment period through the end of next week, I believe, March 21st. And along with my members, we've been developing some comments. I think some takeaways are that we are largely ready for the scope 1 and 2 reporting requirements that will turn on first. But we have reservations around scope 3. And those reservations really do speak to the complexities in our supply chain. So one high level concern is that in some cases, we will not be able to, in a timely fashion, assess the quality of data that is being reported to us from, say, upstream actors. And so when we get into the years later where scope 3 would be audited, that gives us pause. So we will likely in our comments say that some safe harbor would be appropriate to sort of protect companies that are really doing their best to report scope 3, but some inaccuracies might be outside of their control. Similarly, I think the California legislators already acknowledged that scope 3 is still relatively immature in some sectors. And so they did provide a runway for scope 3 reporting to turn on a little later, and then a delay before reasonable assurance or more, let's say, rigid auditing requirements are there in place. But our members are saying, hey, we could use more time than that, because this really does take a lot of work upstream. And it's like a chain reaction. When our vendors are able to report numbers, it might take them a while after, say, their fiscal period ends. We have to then scramble to report, and as many of the folks in the audience know, there's administrative burden connected all along the way there. And then the other big thing that we are pointing out in those comments is related to something that Guillaume brought up, which is the outstanding challenge of how to deal with some market-based instruments. And so the specific example that's worrying dairy in the US is interaction between our supply chain and a pre-existing regulatory program in California, which is the Low Carbon Fuel Standard program that tackles transportation fuels or transportation emissions, I should say. And so we see an overlap here where our supply chains are doing some reporting, and they're also selling credits into that regulatory marketplace. And we think at the very least, there could be a problem of a patchwork of different ways to deal with that. And so we're trying to build consensus around it. So I'll pause there, but that's what's on the horizon. Many of our members are all for reporting their emissions. They just have these call outs of, especially in scope 3, that, hey, our best efforts might not be good enough in some cases.
Yeah, understood. And we'll dive into some of that later, especially around some of those concerns with double counting. Before we do that, I just want a quick overview of the current state of EU compliance regimes that might be impacting agricultural scope 3 reporting. Guillaume, can you just kind of set the stage on that?
Yeah, I will give a briefer one due to the fact that the Green Deal, CSRD, CSDDD, etc., is a mammoth of legislation. But in general, in Europeans corporate sustainability reporting directive, the CSRD, or the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD, or CSDDD for the intimates, is two very strong pillars in the corporate reporting landscape in Europe. Basically, it is a way to report water impacts, climate impact, biodiversity impact, social impacts, or a lot of the impacts that a corporate would have on society within a standardized reporting formats. there's, I think, 12 different impacts to report. One of them being climate change. Climate change in Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Both of these directives are directives. I don't know if how familiar you are with the way the European legislation works, but it's stated by the European Union as a directive and then translated into EU's legislation at each of the member states level, meaning that the interpretation of the directive varies slightly between each member state. Regardless, about 60% of the member states have translated the CSRD into law, France being the first one, and the CSDD only being done in November, if I will, 2024, very recently. Not a lot of companies have done it yet. Not a lot of member states have done it yet. As Mike has alluded to before, because these documents are extremely heavy in burden in reporting requirements. You have to give them assured, limited assurance at the moment, and then reasonable. You have to follow the guidance and the requirements of GHGP across its multiple standards. Due to that, there is a very strong pushback from the political landscape to reduce the scope of this CSRD. At the moment, the CSRD is like a one step at a time. First, very large companies of 1,000 employees. Then next year would be 700 employees and so on and so forth. Basically giving more times for small and medium enterprise or undertaking to get up to the level that they need to be able to report. And there's a huge pushback against this called the omnibus. Omnibus is just a fancy term to say they want to make pretty drastic changes to the two directives. Some changes basically is reducing who would have to report. Up to 80% of the companies that are at the moment under the directive would be cut out. Reduce the burden of work to rather than being required impact or environmental impact or social impact, only selected few, the most important ones, to be defined what that exactly means, and so on and so forth. This is a debate that is ongoing. Yesterday, there was from the center left, center right, left and right, different arguments put forward to either reject the omnibus entirely or accept it and derail basically the Green Deal that was pushed forward for the past 4 or 6 years. What's important to note, though, is that corporates in EU are okay with reporting their emissions, are okay with reporting their impacts. It is just the amount of burden of work and the attached cost of it would be too much for them. That's one piece of the legislation that we could talk hours and hours on it. There is another piece that is less known, which is about the carbon removal and carbon farming regulation, the CRCF. This is a system very similar to ETS system or emission trading scheme systems, where the idea is to stimulate growth and transition to, let's call them greener productions at the farm level through an ETS system of removals at the farm. Meaning that a farm there would be a reference baseline for a specific environment. If you are performing better than that baseline, you generate emission trading schemes or credits, or potentially even insets, to then be traded within the EU to larger companies so that they can reduce their own emissions. That has been signed into a regulation at the EU level in November 2024. This is not a reporting requirement. It is more of a, let's say, a voluntary approach to decarbonize the farming or the agricultural value chain, at least at the tier 4 level.
That's very helpful. And it's interesting, there's like very similar patterns in both these markets. In the case of Europe and California, correct me if I'm wrong, but both of those legislations point to the greenhouse gas protocol as the kind of standard to be doing the inventory reporting. And we were talking before this, and I think Guillaume, you mentioned that because both of these and maybe other compliance regimes globally are pointing to the greenhouse gas protocol, it will be a likely push in the direction of conservatism for GHGP. Like a lot of folks on this call hope and wish that the GHGP would allow more flexibility because of the realities of their complex supply chains. But you had mentioned perhaps it will go
Yeah.
the other way because of these forces. Could you just speak to that a
Yeah, of
bit?
course. Of course, I'll just rewind a little bit back on GHGP and the way it's been created. WRI based, United Nations connected, whatever. The important aspect is the way they develop their corporate standards and descriptive standards. It's through participation of corporates and different entities, thousands of people involved, through a regime of draft, final presentation, final standard format, and then a period of recuperation period where they adjust little things left and right. Basically, there's a huge consultancy for like 5 years for each standards.
Yeah.
This means that for each of the standards, there is a consortium that has been assembled to figure out what it was. What I'm saying to this is that from my previous conversation with you, John and Mike, is that there is rigidity because now it's part of the regulation, but it is still GHGP's mandate, let's call it, to make sure that inventory counting or inventory of corporates is pushed forward. In the past 4 or 5 years, what we've seen with Sustained Third and its partners is that there was a bit of an opening of like potentially we could talk about inset and reduction being deducted in inventories, and that was an opening of the conversation. In the past year, since the in our impression, since the CSRD has been really brought forward as coming right now, and companies have to start doing their reports, the door kind of shut, and GHP kind of separated the physical inventory, the actual tangible emissions part of a value chain, part of an organizational boundaries, and so on, and the impact discussion. For example, in the VCI Climate Week presentation with GHGP, they make a clear distinction on what is the traceability requirements for physical emission and impacts, clearly stipulating the split there. Again, also with the working groups, one on market instruments, on how to deal with these investments, and the others on the other working groups of the GHGP, focusing more on making sure tweaking the LSRG or tweaking a little bit the corporate standards so that it is clear and implementable in a regulatory framework.
Yeah, yeah, and you can see how because of these forces pushing maybe in the direction of slower moving and conservative, the need for some of these more voluntary standards that you spoke of in the beginning to provide some framework for companies looking to take action but wanting to claim that right
Absolutely.
now.
Absolutely.
So yeah,
The
another
reason,
go for
sorry.
it.
Yeah, the reasoning behind it is that there is an assumption that the regulatory framework would be coming to place. But if there is pressure on the CSRD to be shortened or reduced in scope, then the fulfillment of what GHGP is supposed to do is kind of breaking apart, meaning that the role of voluntary carbon mechanism becomes more and more important in this changing landscape, especially if we want to respect our engagement to 1.5 or 2 or well below 2 degrees by 2050, not 2030.
Yeah. Thanks, Guillaume. Another pattern I observe between California and Europe is that there is both a voluntary market for some of these supply chain reductions, and there's some compliance markets. In the case of California and some of the Western US, there's California compliance offsets, there's LCFS markets. In the case of Europe, there's the recently enacted carbon farming and removal, CRCF. So I want to go back to Mike's comment of what he's hearing from his members around, well, how do I move forward? How do I make claims in these markets where I know an intervention might be eligible for one of these compliance regimes, and or for my own voluntary reporting? So Mike, could you kind of double click into that one a little bit, just a little bit more of what you're hearing from your members and perhaps some solutions that you're seeing out there?
Yes, but hopefully it's okay. I'm going to add one sentence to build off what Guillaume was saying to do a take-home point. I thought that was a great explanation, by the way, but because we know that the GHG protocol is in revision, my members and myself were worried that if California, for example, adds too many California-specific elements that go beyond GHG protocol, it'll be a bit too onerous, because ideally these corporations would be able to prepare one GHG accounting report and it would be really seen as equivalent across jurisdictions. And so that dynamic space of regulations still evolving and the international standards still evolving is really providing too much uncertainty to my members. So I just wanted to put a pin in that. So let's talk about, yes, the impact and these different marketplaces. First and foremost, I'd say folks along the dairy value chain, but I think more widely in US agriculture and forestry, see an opportunity for environmental markets to progress and mature to rapidly attack decarbonization. But I think some things are being held back by uncertainties around standards. And so there's room for more participation, for example, and maturing of a voluntary carbon marketplace. But right now, what we're observing, at least in dairy, is that if I did have an intervention on the farm level, for example, I might be able to get a better price for the carbon benefit if I go to a regulatory market that exists in the US than if I went to a voluntary carbon market to transact. So that is one economic thing that is holding back, I think, some projects. On the regulatory project side, again, I said this at the beginning, what we're worried about is ultimately a patchwork of different approaches to dealing with these things, because in my research, the standards only go so deep in terms of specifics about how to interact with such regulatory markets. So not everybody will agree, but I've talked to a few different stakeholders over the last couple of years on this topic in relation to the low carbon fuel standard marketplace. And I get a few different interpretations about where there is gray area and a lot of what if questions. So that's the state of play that we're currently dealing in. And we're just trying to emphasize, one, that we need clarity from both regulators like California Air Resources Board, and possibly also from groups like Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And we're trying to emphasize that when we're talking scope 3, we should acknowledge that there's this overlapping emissions issue along the supply chains. So we're really trying to, at this time, say for dairy, as long as we're really transparent in how we're coming up with our numbers in our reporting, that should be acceptable. So that's what I'm working off of today. That should help us drive more impact if we can agree on that and get some certainty. Then I'll pause there, but you had asked about some of the project types. So I think we could get into that if you want.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I tend to agree, though I might disagree a little bit with the framing. You know, one perspective we have, if you're taking more of like a farmer-focused framing, the fact that there's this patchwork of voluntary and compliance markets, let's say for like a cap and flare manure processing technology in California on a farm, the farmer knows that, you know, these markets are unstable, but 1 year they might be able to monetize through a compliance market. Another year, they might be able to monetize through more of like an insetting or supply chain reduction market. And those diversity of markets provide some level of risk mitigation to them. They do add complexity, and it might not be viewed the same as more at the processor level, who might want to have 100% of the claims funneled through the value chain. But I think it a little bit depends on like the perspective and who you're asking. Because in some cases, we see it as an opportunity to de-risk investments for some farmers too. I'm curious if you, kind of any feedback on that.
Yeah, I love that idea. So one of our major intervention types that I'm sure folks are aware of in US dairy is an anaerobic digestion system that's largely fed or primarily fed by manure. So in that case, with, say, the regulatory marketplace, there's some long-term contracts in play. But I totally agree that if we were to design some things a little differently, you could de-risk. So I know of at least one operation in the US that did design contracts to do more of a sharing of the emissions benefits. And I thought that was good future-looking behavior. And so there could be that. I've also discussed with a few different groups ways that processors, like my main member type, might be able to more creatively get involved in helping finance certain interventions that take a lot of capital, like those digesters. But then we do see opportunity outside the regulatory marketplace for the other end of the cow, as we sometimes say, and that's those enteric methane interventions. And in that case, I think processors are trying to figure out, okay, how can we finance this and then work within the existing standards or the forthcoming standards and still stake a claim to whatever benefit is achieved. The economics should work themselves out there, but one of the main challenges I've heard for that particular type of intervention is that, yes, we definitely need to make clear who's going to pay for it, because at least in the marketplace today, there's hesitancy to adopt a new practice if it's not going to also increase productivity. So the farmer needs to, make sure that they're going to, I think, be made whole, if you will, if they're going to try something new. So we'll see. I'm bullish on some more enteric technologies entering the marketplace.
And enteric would be an example of a category where there really isn't like a compliance regime in the US right now. So all the greenhouse gas benefits would most likely flow in like a voluntary insetting market. Is that right?
Yeah, either through a voluntary carbon marketplace that has nothing to do with the dairy value chain, or what I'm more hopeful of is some sort of insetting arrangement where processors that are buying the milk and added value milk products are able to finance through partnerships in the value chain.
Yeah. So I want to move on a little bit about like that validation and that quality of verification on these individual projects. So what we talked about today was some of these standard bodies are getting developed because right now I would say it's a bit of a wild west because there's not a set of standards to really guide, or there's not a broadly accepted set of standards to really guide value chain interventions or supply chain reductions. There's a lot of different levels of quality of verification, and there's benefits to high verification, but there's also costs. So obviously, SustainCert, you're in this business, Guillaume. SustainCert's in this business. Can you just characterize the level of assurance that a SustainCert validation would provide, and maybe compare it to like running a Cool Farm tool or a FarmES survey, or another tool that maybe some panel participants might be aware of?
All right, no problem. So SustainCert, just a bit of context on SustainCert in this particular aspect. For those that are not aware, SustainCert comes from Gold Standards, one of the leading entities about standardization of carbon credits and methodologies in ACRA certified environments. We offshoot of this, and due to the realization that scope 3 intervention needed some guidance, needed some standards to be able to rely upon. At the time, the LSRG did not exist and so on. So we SustainCert created something they call the rules and we call the rules and requirements, which is a document where we use as a criteria to check how compliance with GHGP is an intervention and what sort of claims you can make narratively and so on and so forth. And within that frame of verification and validation, we can choose, or we can ask our clients what they would prefer, a limited versus a reasonable insurance, basically. That is a choice at the end of the day. The difference is what we actually can state or not state about what happened. Limited being more small in scope and less extensive or comprehensive, if you may, of an audit. We won't check as much things. Well, a reasonable checks more thoroughly on the depth, on some of the monitoring report, and so on and so forth. So in this aspect, the rules and requirement that we have built is a choice between these two levels, even though we still would check some of the same exact same things, just not to the same extent. This is a difference from using, for example, Farm ES or a coal farm tool, any other of those tools that John alluded to, because those tools have not been checked by another entity. They might be built by an academia or by a group of consortium of professionals and experts that know how to model specific flows, but there is still a user inputting the information. There is still the concept of applying that particular methodology or that particular tool in the right context, selecting the appropriate criteria, and so on and so forth. This is what normally a verification and validation is supposed to bring, a sort of validity or trust that the project, the methodology used is fitting to the environment where it is placed. And the rules and requirements that we have built, 0.9 past and now 0.91, help with this. They are meant to look at the monitoring aspects that you have for your farm level emissions and reductions and removals. They are aimed to look at how applicable is the methodology you use to the context that is being used. For example, it would be weird to use the Farm ES for measuring ocean acidification. We would check how valid is that utilization, for example, and so on and so forth. So in most cases, VVBs or verification and validation always operate on this standard. Be it us, another competitor of us. The advantage of us with Stanford is that we have been creating the first rules and requirements 6 years ago and built upon it over iteration of the Food and Ag, be it through fertilizers, be it through dairy, be it through row crops, or even palm oil, cocoa, coffee, all of these more, let's say, different crops rather than just more complicated.
I guess, and that makes sense. And we have experience when we'll be looking at Farm ES data, like before and after of implementing a manure intervention, and seeing even, for example, like the version 3 of Farm ES, just seeing how basically, in short, inaccurate that intervention will be in Farm ES vis-a-vis a very in-depth methodological approach that SustainCert would then verify. So we have, 3 Degrees has firsthand experience seeing that difference. But the flip side is the SustainCert approach, getting that level of assurance, it can be expensive, and it's also, administratively more complex. So is there any rules of the road of like when a high level of verification and a SustainCert-esque approach makes sense versus maybe a lower level of that quantification, accuracy, and verification?
I think this is a very good point, John. It's true, validation is not free. It's an expensive endeavor. You're hiring auditors, you're hiring a whole company to take a look at a project, and that costs money and time. That's very true. What we've been seeing with our clients is that they come for validation and verification in using multiple criteria. They don't do it for all of their interventions. It would be interesting for us to do it, of course, but they look at the size of what they're doing. For example, if they're looking only at a farm level of one singular paddy, or maybe it's 6 or 7 hectares, the validation and verification for them is not very interesting. However, if that intervention is affecting their supply chain at the level of Massachusetts, for example, or at the level of North Dakota, then suddenly making sure that the values coming out of that interventions are suited is more attractive for alleviating the risk, as you were talking before about the uncertainty of some of those Farm ES factors or other tools. So that is one of the first criteria that we're trying to make our customer understand is what are you trying to do and what is the size you want. The larger is, the more likely we can apply the same methodology, so the same validation to a larger scope. And then the verification of the value becomes quicker and quicker with time, and we don't have to recheck the methodology. That's the first part. The second part is the complexity around the quantification of emission. If you are using a very thorough, multivariate, stochastic approach with uncertainty factors left and right, the human mind eventually struggles to understand those numbers. Having someone else check those values, this complexity, is a benefit, is something that our clients have wanting. If on the other hand, you are only using emission factors or simple physiochemical models that do not have dynamic nature or whatnot, then the complexity is much more lower, and a reporting or another person could read those outcomes more easily. Verification might not be as interesting there. So you have these two criteria that if you combine them and you have a large intervention which is highly complex, then suddenly having a VVB look at the information and provide assurance, limited or reasonable as a choice of the client, becomes interesting. But you're still right, John, the price is still a problem. This is why Sustain Cert as a technological focus, which is to improve the process using tools like, sounds a bit cliche now, but like AI and other aspects to kind of streamline the process, making sure that everything goes quickly and for the lower cost for both us and them.
Yeah. Yep. And I think that's somewhat how we're thinking about it. Capital intensive, high volume, high impact. Maybe you want a higher quality of assurance. Smaller impact, less capital intensive, maybe not. I want to get to one or two audience questions. This could maybe be to both of you. I'll read it, maybe interpret it a little. How should value chain corporates, so how should maybe food companies looking to reduce their Scope 3 emissions, think about EU banks that are also obligated to reduce Scope 3 emissions with their lending portfolios that overlap at the farm level? So maybe one way I interpret that question is like, there's numerous companies for whom a farm will be in their Scope 3. And how do you think about kind of that dynamic? I don't know if either Guillaume or Mike, you have some thoughts on this question.
I'll quickly say, I think that that's a smart consideration, right? Thinking about the financial institution partners in these supply chains too. I personally think if we have more digital traceability of what's going on in the future, that will help assure all parties, including the financial institutions. Thinking optimistically, I would hope that at least showing outcomes from, say, interventions at a farm level would go into the risk calculus when making loans from financial institutions, and then very optimistically perhaps be connected in some way to, you know, an interest rate. So I think that's where we need to go, because when the money gets involved, I think sometimes it drives results. So.
Great. Yeah, and I think my experience has been that of the large financial institutions that have, you know, large farm land holdings, I haven't seen major investments from them in decarbonization projects at the farm level, personally. I have seen you know, a desire to quantify climate risks in their portfolios, but I think it's a little different dynamic than maybe like multiple food brands downstream that might be either cooperating or competing to sponsor or support emission reductions at the farm level, which I see like all the time. I think we're at the end of time. There's one or two other questions that we can follow up one to one based on the question askers. But thank you all for tuning into this webinar. As we mentioned, we'll be sending you a recording. Gina, I don't know if there's any final poll or steps on your end, but if not, I think we can conclude the webinar. And also, of course, thank you so much to Guillaume and Mike for making time and sharing their really insightful take on this very complex space. So thank you.
No worries.
Thank you. There's always more to say, right?
Yeah.
Always. Me too.